So Emmanuel Macron was in the UK this week. He was the first EU leader to be given an official state visit with all the royal pomp and all that jazz since Brexit. He was even allowed to address Parliament, which is a bit of a coup for him. They've also agreed this migration deal, which we can talk about a bit later. But Tom, I wondered if we could talk first of all about Macron's address to Parliament, because I think that said a lot about where we are, where Europe is politically.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, there were the kind of key lines that people were expecting about foreign policy, about Russia, about Israel, about all these points that you can imagine, given that kind of stage, Macron would like to make his stance known on. I thought it was particularly interesting about the amount of gushing that was going on, to be frank. I think there was a kind of, as is often the case with the sort of liberal great and good in this country, they do tend to see European leaders as so much kind of slicker, more sophisticated, so much more competent than their equivalents over here. Given over here we've got Keir Starmer, maybe that's slightly more understandable, but nevertheless, I mean, you know, Macron is just a slightly more polished version of the same kind of lame duck, you know. And it's interesting that kind of worst kind of elitist Europhilia which exists seems to only really be sustained by complete ignorance of what's going on in France.
Yeah.
What a lame duck he's become, how hated he is, the fact that he's failed to do any of the reforms that he wanted to because the public have rejected them so clearly. And also maybe just a sort of fondness for accents or whatever. But it was really kind of striking the similarity between those two figures. Starmer has gotten to this lamed up position a lot earlier than Macron has, 1 year into his premiership rather than 8 years into Macron's premiership. I think they are both representatives of that old technocratic way of doing politics whose day is up.
Yeah.
They can walk around saying that we're going to be part of, forging a new future which navigates against populism and people going insane on the internet and the new threats which exist, but no one really believes them. And we're waiting for that kind of politics to shuffle off the stage, basically.
I mean, he made a point of, challenging disinformation on Facebook, and he raised very important documentary, as Keir Starmer sees it, adolescence, so that teaches us about the dangers of social media, all the usual kind of crap that we're used to hearing.
I mean, I think, Tom made the key point, which is that this is really like the last breath of that old order, and they're like just clinging on for dear life, pretending as if everything is just the same and normal. These very sensible, technocratic adults in the room, leaders, and coming to save the day. And the reality is both Macron and Starmer have serious challenges from the kind of populist wing of politics, civil disobedience and disruption, both in the UK and France, and that both of them are, regarded very poorly by the general population of their respective countries. And I think this has been one of the prominent themes of the kind of Starmer government, is this fixation on the international stage. Like, no doubt, obviously, what's going on in the world is important, but it's almost as if he uses this grandstanding as a way to avoid confronting complex domestic challenges. I mean, he famously said in that interview that he prefers Davos to Parliament, but I mean, it's become a cliche. But actually, if you really think about that is pretty remarkable. That something completely distant from most people, completely unaccountable, no democratic oversight. He prefers that. He's more comfortable in that space than actually the real cut and thrust of democratic politics. And so, when I speak to many people, senior figures in the Labour Party, and I ask, what do you think has been like the best achievement of Keir Starmer? It's always, he's improved Britain's reputation internationally, but nothing to do with the deep-seated challenges that we face in this country around energy, around, regional inequality, around migration. It's all to do with just how he makes certain people in elite spaces feel about themselves when they're talking to their international counterparts. And I just think this is just yet another example of Starmer getting more clout out of vague kind of statements about the world stage than actually things that materially and concretely everyday people are bothered with.
No, absolutely. And just to go back to that point about that bit in Macron's speech about social media, where he says that, the democratic models of Europe are embattled by foreign interference and information manipulation. And there was a point about, people's minds being taken over by horrendous emotions, addictions to social media. I'm sure he's talking about, French people rather than himself. But, that the willingness to indulge those kinds of narratives, I think, is really telling. I mean, you see it across the board from various different technocratic sort of centre-left leaders. And I think it's an expression of their authoritarianism, obviously. There's no problem that they don't think clamping down on social media won't solve, but also how weak they are.
Yeah.
They've sort of recognised that their day is over, that their solutions are not only unpopular, but actively damaging to the societies that they're supposed to govern over. And so they kind of hunker down and become increasingly authoritarian. The problem is not me. The problem is that there are too many people spouting insane opinions on the internet. Whenever they say they want to protect democracy from social media, really they're trying to protect themselves from social media most of the time. And, Macron, he's managed to cling on to the Elysee for 8 years, but he's as we were talking about earlier, he's a catastrophic failure. Everything that he's attempted to do, reforming the French state, whether it's trying to make Europe and the European Union rather, a kind of global superpower, he's failed miserably.
Yeah.
And he was supposed to be the guy who would defeat populism. Back in 2017 when he won, The Economist literally depicted him as Jesus Christ walking on water. And now he's being assailed both by the populist left and the populist right. So it's the authoritarianism that we see in Europe, in this country, across the board really, is an expression of weakness as much as anything else. Not to say that it can't be tyrannical in its own way, in the way that we've covered in this podcast many times, but you kind of get the sense that they know their day is over as well, which is why they've had to blame the electorate for their failings rather than fess up to the fact that, their prescriptions have always been toxic to begin with.
Definitely. We should talk, before moving on, a bit about the migration deal that's been done today.
Another coup for Keir Starmer.
A great achievement by Keir Starmer. Another negotiating triumph. So he started off the week saying that he was going to introduce a one-in, one-out policy for Channel boat migrants. So the idea would be that basically France would take back anyone in Britain who had just arrived on a small boat, and then in exchange they would find someone who maybe has a legitimate claim to live in Britain, and then there'd be a sort of swap so that everyone going to Britain would have a legitimate claim to asylum, and people going on the small boats would know where you're being sent back. Somehow the French have managed to barter Keir Starmer down from 1 in, 1 out to 17 in, 1 out, which is pretty extraordinary. I mean, that's even worse than his capitulation over fishing, where he promised to extend fishing rights for a couple of years. They managed to get 12 years of EU rules on fishing out of him. I mean, he is a kind of negotiating disaster. You do feel like every time he's going to walk into a room with some other world leader, Britain's going to lose. I mean, what have you made of this week, though?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned fishing. There's also the kind of Chagos deal. There's also, obviously various speculation around the trade deal that was done in India that many people felt that it wasn't exactly clear about, how Britain benefits from that. And now similarly, with this. And I think that it's just yet another example of how Starmer doesn't really understand the concerns that people have. I think, regardless of what people think about immigration more generally, I think it's just clear that people want those boats stopped and don't really think anyone should be making that journey, regardless of us, swapping one person here or there. But it's interesting, I think it was saying that, if they have a connection to Britain in some way, that they'll be brought in. I mean, that's incredibly vague. I mean, is speaking English, a connection to Britain, or some, very, very distant kind of third uncle, cousin, perhaps a connection as well? I mean, you see these stories that have been...
My friend already went over on the small boat.
Exactly. I mean, you see these stories that have been reported in a lot of the right-wing kind of press about all of these asylum claims, and they're able to stay in the country on what many people would regard as extremely tenuous reasons. So even that, what if they essentially want to appeal the decision to be moved to France? Will they not have then a hugely lengthy, appeals process as well? So again, it's just this headline so that he can say, look at this great thing that I've got, again, once again on the international stage. But the substance of it seems to be totally out of whack from the concrete question of how we actually get a grip with this really difficult issue.
And it seems as if as long as we're signatories to the ECHR, but also as long as we have kind of homegrown activist judges, then we will continue to see people being allowed to stay in Britain for reasons. Well, there's one this week who was allowed to stay because he has a speech impediment. People have been allowed to stay because they're
foreign chicken nuggets.
Their child doesn't like the chicken nuggets back in Albania, so family can't be sent there. And one of the most grotesque examples was of the Zimbabwean paedophile, and it was believed that if he was sent back to his home country, he might have a bit of a rough time.
Yeah.
I think he'd have a rough time here if people knew he was a paedophile. But there you go.
Just another thing on that. And there's someone that said something, Jeremy Hunt, the former Chancellor of all people, that I actually thought was quite interesting. The irony with Keir Starmer is that he's a human rights lawyer. This could actually be a great thing for him to champion reforming a lot of these international legislation, because they're clearly not fit for purpose. If he seriously opposes us leaving the European Court of Human Rights, which I don't, I support us leaving, but if he really opposes that, one of the ways that you can do something about that is at least challenge or champion reforming it.
Yeah.
And actually he would be a very good person presumably to do it, given that he has a human rights legal background. But the kind of complete lack of political imagination or will, or taking a real grip on this issue, means that ironically it makes it much more likely that we're going to leave.
Yeah, I mean he's basically accelerating us to the exit, because it's not just him. You have Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, who time and again has made clear his absolute total commitment to. He says, we need to go above and beyond what international law asks, let alone reforming it. But there are people in the Labour government. Shabana Mahmood has been, or at least some of her sources around her have been making noises that she's obviously chafing against some of these ridiculous judgments. But yeah, you feel like Starmer is not going to wake up to this until it's too late, as is so often the case with him.
And for really stupid, superficial reasons. Keir Starmer is a human rights barrister by background, as is Lord Herman. That's how they met and so on. But you just get the sense that purely because those two words are put together, that therefore they're terrified of touching it, as if when this whole legal architecture was drawn up in the wake of the war, they envisaged people like the Afghan sex offender who was worried that his compulsive masturbation might lead to him being ostracised in his native Afghanistan and therefore should have the right to stay here, or it would envisage the Albanian criminal's son who could only had a taste for Western-made chicken nuggets. I mean, the whole thing is so obviously absurd. Everyone can see this now. The spotlight that has been put on it in recent days, to the point where you can't open a newspaper without being confronted by such an absurd case. But you do think this genuinely just comes down to something as simple as, it would look a bit gross to go near that. Is there any actual principled defence of the status quo that exists? And also, in terms of the small boats, you could be the most pro-migration person. Do you really think that a system which effectively incentivises people coming from, whether it's the Middle East or whether it's North Africa, having to run the gauntlet of criminal gangs, taking perilous journeys across the Mediterranean and across the English Channel, all for the great bounty of the right to work in the English black market? Is that really a kind of a situation that works for anyone? Certainly not for the British public, who obviously reject it. But this is clearly not a kind of positive, sustainable position, but purely because they don't want to be seen as on the other side, the kind of proto-Nazi side, if Lord Hermer is to be believed. They don't want to touch it. And that I think that is changing. In Europe, you're increasingly seeing politicians and figures you wouldn't expect start to talk about reform. But at the same time, as ever, Keir Starmer is the slowest kid in the class where this sort of thing is concerned.
And just quickly on that, I mean, the one thing that many people actually broadly welcomed was his immigration speech about, Britain being an island of strangers or at risk.
People recognise that. People could relate to that.
The poll showed that actually the majority of people across parties broadly agreed with this sentiment. Yeah. He regretted it. He wished he never made that speech. So even if, you do see certain shifts happening in some sections of the Labour Party and other parts across Europe, Starmer himself, where the buck stops, just doesn't fundamentally get it.
That's because, like Ron Burgundy, he says he'll read whatever you put on the teleprompter.
Yeah,
exactly.